It started like any other quiet morning in the small town of Everpine. The air was cool, the mist still hung low over the trees, and the forest seemed half asleep. A man named Daniel, who spent most of his free time flying drones for fun, packed his camera gear and set off toward the woods. He had always loved capturing the early sunlight cutting through the tall pines. But that morning, something caught his eye that changed everything about his simple hobby. As his drone climbed higher, the live feed on his phone started showing something odd. At first, it looked like a clearing hidden deep inside the forest. Then, as the camera focused, he froze. Right there, under layers of vines and trees, was something massive, something that looked completely out of place. The shape was smooth, curved like the side of a ship. It stretched longer than a football field, yet the nearest body of water was miles away. Daniel thought it was a trick of light. He circled the drone again, zoomed in, and this time his jaw dropped. It wasn't a warehouse or an aircraft hangar or even an old train station. It looked exactly like the side of a cruise ship, complete with portholes, faded paint, and what seemed like a deck railing at the top. He stared at the screen, speechless. A ship in the middle of the forest? How could that even be possible? He hurried home and uploaded the footage online. At first, people thought it was fake, maybe some kind of visual effect or clever prank. But within hours, locals who lived near the forest began confirming that they'd seen something strange there too. Some mentioned hearing metallic echoes when chopping wood nearby. Others said they'd seen big construction trucks heading into the woods years ago and never coming back out. By the next day, Daniel's video had gone viral. News outlets began calling it the forest ship mystery. Reporters and photographers came rushing into the sleepy town, eager to see the strange sight for themselves. The small roadside diners filled with people debating what it could be. Some thought it was part of a movie set. Others were convinced it was a hidden military project. A few even whispered about alien technology, because no one could explain how a ship that large ended up surrounded by trees. The local authorities quickly stepped in. They set up metal barriers and signs that said no trespassing. Dangerous area. But that only made the public even more curious. Helicopters flew over, snapping pictures of the forest. On social media, satellite images started circulating. From above, the structure's outline was clear. A gigantic vessel shape resting quietly among the green canopy, almost as if nature itself had decided to hide it away. For the people of Everpine, life had suddenly become exciting. The forest, once a peaceful backdrop to their quiet days, had become a place of wonder and questions. Children whispered stories about a shipwreck that somehow sailed through time. Old fishermen at the harbor argued that maybe the ocean once reached farther inland. Every theory seemed crazier than the last, but everyone wanted to believe in something extraordinary. One afternoon, a local journalist named Peter decided to drive as close as he could to the restricted zone. He had grown up in that town, and he remembered stories his grandfather used to tell about strange noises coming from the woods back in the 1970s. No one had ever taken those tales seriously, but now he wasn't so sure. When he parked near the forest's edge, he saw large tire marks on the ground, as if heavy trucks had been moving in and out recently. He also noticed how eerily quiet everything felt. The birds weren't singing, and even the wind seemed to avoid that place. That night, Peter wrote a short article about his visit, describing the heavy silence and the metallic glint he thought he saw between the trees. The article spread fast, and curiosity grew even more. Soon groups of explorers began sneaking into the forest, trying to get a closer look despite the warnings. Some came back with blurry photos. Others said they heard humming sounds like machinery still running deep inside. It didn't take long before online forums and local radio shows were filled with wild theories. Some believed it was an unfinished Cold War project, a secret ship built by engineers who wanted to hide a vessel inland in case of a nuclear attack. Others believed it was part of an eccentric billionaire's failed dream. A few people insisted it was haunted, saying the forest lights up faintly at night where the ship stands. As the days passed, more people came. Locals began renting out rooms, turning the mystery into an opportunity. Cafes served drinks named Ship in the Woods coffee and Captain Secret tea. The town's economy, once sleepy and quiet, suddenly started booming. But beneath all the excitement, there was also unease. The forest wasn't meant for this kind of attention, and for those who had lived near it their entire lives, it now felt like the trees were guarding something they didn't want disturbed. A week after Daniel's video, a government research team arrived. They sealed off the area completely. Rumors spread that they had found something unusual inside, though no one knew what. Reporters tried to get close, but the guards pushed them back. At night, locals said they saw bright lights moving deep between the trees like flashlights and cranes working in silence. The tension in town grew. The more the officials tried to keep things quiet, the more people wanted to know the truth. One evening, Daniel stood on a small hill overlooking the forest. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and gold. He couldn't stop thinking about that first moment when he saw the strange object on his drone screen. It didn't feel like an accident anymore. Something about it seemed too deliberate, as if whoever built it had wanted it to be hidden, waiting for someone to find it years later. He wasn't alone in feeling that way. Across town, Peter and a few friends began talking about organizing an independent expedition. They wanted to see it with their own eyes. Not through a fence, not from a drone, but up close. They gathered maps, flashlights, and old stories. Every piece of information they could find led them back to the same part of the forest, where the trees grew tallest and the air always seemed cooler. Before they could act, though, another unexpected twist caught everyone's attention. A local environmental worker leaked a set of high-resolution aerial photos showing that the structure wasn't just big, it was massive. It had multiple decks, an upper structure that resembled a bridge, and large sections that looked like open halls. The image went viral instantly. People began comparing the ship's size to famous cruise liners, realizing it wasn't a small structure at all. It was full-scale, like something meant to sail across oceans. The town became divided. Some residents believed it should remain untouched, a part of history preserved by nature. Others wanted to open it up for tourism and make it a landmark. But for Daniel and Peter, this wasn't about money or fame. They just wanted to understand the truth. Late one night, when the forest was quiet and the guards had left for their break, Daniel decided to go back. He carried only his flashlight and a camera. As he stepped into the woods, the sounds of crickets filled the air. The ground was damp and soft, the smell of moss heavy around him. The deeper he went, the colder it became. His heart pounded with every step, but curiosity pushed him forward. After nearly an hour, he reached a clearing where moonlight spilled across the trees. And there it was, a vast wall of rusted metal rising from the earth like the side of a sleeping beast. Up close, it was even more unbelievable. The metal was covered in vines and moss, but under the moonlight, he could see faint letters once painted on the side. He brushed his hand across the surface, and the dirt fell away to reveal white paint beneath. Letters that spelled part of a name, though most were unreadable. His breath caught. The wall extended far beyond what his flashlight could reach. Above him, through the branches, he saw railings and what looked like balconies. The forest was so quiet it felt sacred. Daniel stood there, overwhelmed. The air smelled of iron and wet leaves. He realized this wasn't just an accident or a random structure. This ship had been placed here, and whoever built it wanted it hidden. He snapped a few photos, but his hands were shaking too much to hold the camera steady. When a low creaking sound came from somewhere inside, he turned off his light, holding his breath. The sound faded. It could have been the wind, or something else. When he finally returned home before dawn, his clothes were damp and his shoes were covered in mud, but his mind couldn't stop racing. He didn't tell anyone what he saw that night, not yet. He knew this was only the beginning, because that massive ship, buried in silence and shadows, still held secrets no one was ready for. And deep inside the forest, under layers of green, the giant waited, as if it had been expecting someone to find it all along. The news about the mysterious ship hidden in the forest had reached every corner of the town, and by now, even people from other cities were driving in just to get a glimpse of the restricted area. But no one really knew what was inside. The government had sealed it off. Reporters were kept away, and locals were left with nothing but rumors. That was when a small group decided they couldn't wait any longer. They wanted to see the truth with their own eyes. Daniel, the man who had first discovered the ship with his drone, had been restless ever since his secret night visit. He hadn't told anyone what he'd seen up close, the letters on the hull, the eerie creak from inside, but the image of that rusted metal giant haunted his thoughts. He knew it was risky, but he couldn't stop thinking about what might be hiding behind those steel walls. He wasn't the only one feeling that way. Peter, The journalist who had written about the forest's strange silence had spent days interviewing old residents. He found stories buried deep in memory, whispers about construction trucks going into the woods decades ago and never coming back, rumors about a businessman with a wild dream who disappeared without a trace. When Peter shared what he'd found with Daniel, they both agreed. The only way to uncover the truth was to go in themselves. But they needed help. They reached out to an older man named Howard, a retired naval engineer who had once worked on shipbuilding projects. He was quiet and thoughtful, the kind of person who didn't believe in wild theories. When Daniel showed him the photos and drone footage, Howard's expression changed from disbelief to shock. He leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the design of the structure. "This isn't a regular cruise ship," he said softly. "Look at the hull, it's flat, not curved. And the propeller area looks wrong. It's built like it was meant to sit, not float." That one sentence changed everything. They decided to form a small team, just the three of them, plus a young filmmaker named Leo, who often explored abandoned places for his YouTube channel. Leo wasn't interested in fame this time. He wanted the story to be real, something no one could fake. He packed his camera, drone, and lights, promising to document everything from start to finish. They waited until nightfall. The moon was barely visible, and fog rolled through the trees, making the forest look like something out of a dream. Each of them carried only what they needed: flashlights, ropes, gloves, and a small first aid kit. When they reached the barrier, they found that one section of the wire fence had already been damaged, likely by other explorers who tried to sneak in before them. They slipped through quietly and followed a narrow path Daniel remembered from his first trip. Every step felt heavier the closer they got. The ground smelled of wet earth and iron, and the trees grew thicker, their branches forming dark arches above their heads. After nearly 40 minutes of walking, they reached the clearing. For a moment, no one spoke. The massive ship loomed before them, half hidden under vines and moss. Its curved sides rose into the mist, towering above the treetops. Even though Daniel had seen it before, the sight still gave him chills. Leo lifted his camera slowly and began to record. The sound of his breathing filled the quiet air. Peter shone his flashlight on the hull, revealing faded blue paint and patches of rust. The letters that Daniel had once touched were now clearly visible under the beam. SS Nova Horizon. "That's a cruise liner name," Howard said softly. "But I've never heard of it. Not in any naval records." They walked along the side until they found a metal staircase leading upward. The railings were broken, but it looked climbable. Howard tested each step with his boot before trusting it. The metal groaned under their weight, echoing into the night. At the top, they reached what appeared to be a side deck. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves. Broken glass glittered faintly in their lights. In front of them stood a large door, slightly open, its hinges rusted but still intact. "Here we go," Leo whispered, pointing his camera toward it. Daniel pushed the door gently. It creaked open, releasing a burst of stale air that smelled of dust and metal. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The first thing they saw was a long hallway lined with mirrors on both sides. The glass was cracked and the reflections looked ghostly and warped. Old wall lights hung loosely from the ceiling, their bulbs covered in cobwebs. The carpet beneath their feet was faded, its original color long gone. Howard ran his hand along the wall. "This is real steel," he said. "This whole thing was built to last. But why here?" They moved deeper inside, passing door after door, each one leading to a small cabin. Inside, they found rotting furniture, old suitcases, and piles of dust-covered linen. It was as if the place had been frozen in time, untouched since the day it was abandoned. Peter opened one cabin and froze. There was an old newspaper lying on the table, its edges yellowed and brittle. He picked it up carefully and tried to read the headline. It was dated 1971. The headline read, "Land Cruise Project Faces Shutdown." "Land Cruise?" Daniel repeated, confused. Howard's face darkened. "That explains the flat hull," he said quietly. "Whoever built this wasn't planning to sail it. They were building a stationary resort, something shaped like a ship but meant to stay on land." They exchanged stunned looks. It sounded insane, but everything around them made sense now. They continued exploring, moving toward what looked like a grand staircase. Even in the dim light, they could see how luxurious it must have been once. A red carpet, now faded brown, ran down the middle. At the top, Two chandeliers hung crookedly, their crystals still shimmering faintly when the light hit them. Leo couldn't stop filming. "People are going to lose their minds when they see this," he whispered. But not everything was peaceful. As they walked further, they began hearing faint sounds like water dripping and once, what sounded like a door slamming somewhere in the distance. They froze, looking at each other, unsure if it was just the old structure shifting or something else moving inside. Daniel turned off his flashlight for a moment, and the darkness felt alive. The air seemed thicker, heavier. He quickly turned it back on. They reached what appeared to be a large hall. Tables and chairs were still arranged neatly, though everything was covered in dust. A grand piano stood at one end, its keys yellowed with age. Someone had left a glass sitting beside it as if they had just stepped out for a moment. Peter whispered, "It feels like everyone just vanished in the middle of something." Howard nodded. They probably ran out of money or were forced to leave. But this much work, this couldn't have been just a small project. Then they noticed a small control panel near the wall. It looked like a power switchboard. Most of it was dead, but one tiny red light still blinked faintly. Howard leaned closer, frowning. "That shouldn't be possible," he said. "There's no power grid out here." Suddenly, a faint buzz filled the air. For a few seconds, the old intercom system crackled to life, releasing a burst of static before going silent again. They all froze. Leo whispered, "Did you hear that?" No one answered. They just stood there, the sound still ringing in their ears. Howard checked the wires and shook his head. "This system hasn't worked in decades." "That shouldn't happen." Daniel swallowed hard. "Maybe there's a backup generator still somewhere. Or maybe someone else has been here." The thought made everyone uneasy. They decided to move toward the bridge, the upper section that looked like the control room. The stairs leading up were steep and half-broken, but they managed to climb carefully. Inside, they found a large room with broken windows overlooking the forest. Old control panels lined the walls, their levers and buttons rusted but intact. Maps were still pinned to a corkboard, some showing detailed blueprints of the ship's structure. Howard ran his fingers over the maps. "This was never finished," he said. "Half the systems are missing, but it's a masterpiece of design. Whoever planned this knew exactly what they were doing." Then Peter found something tucked inside a drawer, a photograph. It showed a group of men standing proudly in front of the ship during its construction. In the middle stood a man in a suit smiling confidently. On the back of the photo there was a handwritten note, "For the dream that never sailed." They stood in silence, realizing they were standing inside that very dream, forgotten, abandoned and buried by time. As they left the bridge, Daniel turned one last time to look out over the forest through the broken window. The trees swayed quietly in the night breeze, almost like they were whispering. "This place isn't done telling its story," he said softly. And though none of them knew it yet, what they would find next would change everything they believed about the ship and the man who built it. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the forest, painting soft gold lines on the ground. The group sat quietly in a small cafe at the edge of town, their coffee untouched. No one spoke for a long time. The night's discoveries still hung heavy in the air. Daniel finally broke the silence. "We need to go back," he said, his voice low but steady. "There's more inside." "We barely saw half of it." Peter nodded slowly. He had spent most of the night rereading the old newspaper they found, the one about the land cruise project. The words still echoed in his head. Someone had built that massive structure on purpose, but why abandon it so completely? Howard, the retired engineer, leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. "That ship was never meant to float. The hull design, the foundation, everything about it was meant for stability, not sailing. Whoever planned that project wanted to build something that felt like a cruise but stayed on land." Leo, the young filmmaker, was already reviewing his footage on his laptop. Every frame looked unreal. The chandeliers, the grand staircase, the name SS Nova Horizon painted across the hull. "People are going to think this is a movie set," he said softly. "But it's not. It's all real." They decided to return before the authorities closed the area completely. That afternoon, they packed extra lights, batteries, and food. They knew they might stay longer this time. When they reached the forest again, the sun was dipping low, turning the sky a dull orange. The air felt cooler and the woods seemed quieter than before. Even the birds had stopped singing. It was as if the forest knew they were coming back. They slipped through the same gap in the fence and followed the narrow path, their footsteps muffled by layers of damp leaves. When they finally reached the clearing, the ship stood there exactly as before, silent, enormous, and still partly hidden by trees. As they climbed up the broken staircase, Leo whispered, "It feels different this time." Howard nodded. Places like this, they have their own kind of presence. Inside, the air was still thick and stale. Dust floated in their flashlight beams like falling snow. They retraced their steps through the grand hallway and staircase, but this time, they noticed small details they'd missed before. Old nameplates on doors, faded paintings on the walls, and a faint smell of something burnt near the lower decks. Daniel stopped near one of the stairways leading down. "We didn't go below yesterday," he said. "Maybe that's where the power source is." The light on that switchboard didn't just appear from nowhere. Howard agreed. If there's any generator left, it's probably in the engine section. They followed the staircase down into the belly of the ship. The steps groaned with every movement. Their flashlights flickered across rusted pipes and walls streaked with moisture. The air grew colder and heavier, carrying a faint metallic taste. At the bottom, they reached a large corridor. It was darker here, the smell stronger, like old oil and wet iron. They moved slowly, their lights catching glimpses of machinery that looked frozen mid-construction. Some parts were unfinished, with wires dangling from the ceiling. Leo filmed quietly, whispering to his camera. "We're in the lower decks now. It looks like an engine room, but everything's wrong. There are no propellers, no water pumps. It's not built for movement." Howard examined a large metal structure in the center of the room. It looked like a generator, but not the kind he recognized. "This is strange," he said. "It's not connected to any fuel source. It's like it was meant to simulate the hum and vibration of a ship engine, to make people feel like they were moving, even when they weren't." Peter's eyes widened. "So the entire idea was to create the illusion of a cruise voyage without ever leaving land?" Howard nodded. "That's exactly it. A landlocked cruise experience. Brilliant, and completely impractical. They explored deeper, moving through narrow maintenance corridors. The deeper they went, the more unfinished everything became. Metal beams were left exposed, walls half-painted, and tools still scattered around as if the workers had dropped everything and walked away. In one small control room, Daniel found a cabinet filled with documents, blueprints, receipts, and letters. The papers were yellow and fragile, but still readable. The letterhead read, "Nova Horizon Resorts Limited." He began reading one aloud. "To our investors, we assure you the project will redefine tourism forever. Guests will enjoy the grandeur of the sea without leaving the comfort of land." Peter whistled under his breath. That's bold. They really believed in this. But at the bottom of the stack, one letter stood out. It was handwritten, not typed, and the ink had slightly faded. Daniel held it closer to the light. "Delays are costing too much. We've lost half the funding. I can't stop now. The dream has to live." There was no signature, just the initials RM. Howard frowned. RM. Maybe the businessman who started it all. They pocketed the letter and moved on. At the end of the corridor, they reached a large steel door. It was sealed shut, but the bolts were rusted and weak. Howard examined it. "Looks like it hasn't been opened in decades." Daniel pressed his ear against the metal. "Do you hear that?" There was a faint sound, barely noticeable, like a steady hum coming from the other side. They exchanged uneasy looks. Howard used a small wrench from his bag to loosen the bolts. The door resisted at first, then slowly creaked open, sending a wave of cold air out into the corridor. Their flashlights cut through the darkness inside. What they saw left them speechless. It was a ballroom, massive and breathtaking even in decay. The ceiling was domed and painted with murals of the sky and clouds, as if guests were meant to feel like they were sailing beneath open skies. The chandeliers still hung in place, covered in cobwebs but glimmering faintly. Rows of tables stood perfectly aligned, and a stage sat at the far end, complete with instruments and microphones still in place. Leo whispered, "It's like they just stopped in the middle of a party." They stepped inside carefully. Daniel brushed his fingers over one of the tables and found dust-covered plates, glasses, and silverware still set. A few old menus lay scattered around, the print barely readable. Each menu listed luxurious dishes: lobster, roast duck, chocolate soufflé. It was all so grand, but now so haunting. Howard walked toward the stage. He looked up at the mural, then at the instruments. This must have been the heart of the project. The main attraction. Peter turned his flashlight toward the far wall and froze. Guys, look at this. There, mounted on the wall, was a row of old speakers connected to the intercom system. A control panel beneath them blinked faintly again, the same weak red light they had seen earlier. Howard moved closer. This system is isolated. It shouldn't still be active. Just as he reached for the switch, a crackle echoed through the speakers. Static filled the room, followed by a faint voice so faint they could barely make out the words. "Welcome aboard. Please enjoy your stay." Then silence. No one moved. The only sound was their breathing. Peter whispered, Did someone trigger it?" Howard shook his head. "No, that message is pre-recorded. It must have been triggered by movement." Daniel looked around uneasily. "But that means the motion sensors still work." After all these years? The silence stretched. The forest wind outside howled faintly through the broken windows, making the chandeliers sway gently. Howard finally spoke. "This place is running on something we don't understand yet. We need to find the main power source." They continued exploring the ballroom, finding an exit door at the back leading to another corridor. This one seemed newer, less decayed. The walls were cleaner, the floor less dusty. It led to a room that looked like a suite, larger, more luxurious than the others. Inside they found a grand desk, leather chairs, and framed sketches of the ship's design. On the desk sat a small brass plate that read, "Captain's Quarters." Peter whispered, "So the builder had his own office here." Daniel opened one of the drawers and found an old journal. The pages were covered in hurried handwriting, dated across several months in 1970. The entries talked about progress, delays, financial pressure, and a deep sense of obsession. The final page simply read, "If they abandon the dream, I won't. I'll stay with her until the end." The group fell silent again. The realization hit them like a weight. The man who built this ship might have stayed behind when everyone else left. Leo closed his camera slowly. "This isn't just an abandoned building," he said softly. "It's someone's entire life." They left the room in silence. Outside, the forest was darker now, and the faint hum from the generators seemed to follow them as they climbed back toward the deck. When they finally reached the open air, Daniel looked back at the ship's towering frame. The moonlight glinted off the metal, giving it a strange, dreamlike glow. "Whoever built this," he said quietly, "was trying to make people believe in something impossible." Howard nodded, and maybe he did, for a while. They didn't know it yet, but the next discovery, the truth hidden in the captain's quarters, would reveal a story far deeper and stranger than anyone expected. The night after their discovery, none of them could sleep. The words from the old journal kept replaying in their minds. "I'll stay with her until the end." Those few lines carried something heavy, almost sad, as if the man who wrote them had poured everything he had into the ship. Daniel sat on his porch with the journal in his hands. The cover was cracked, the pages yellow, and the handwriting shaky but filled with emotion. He flipped through them again under the porch light. The earlier entries spoke of hope and vision. The man had dreamed of building something the world had never seen before, a cruise ship that would never sail, a floating resort on solid ground. He wrote about guests dancing under chandeliers, families dining in luxury, and people finding joy in a place where the sea was only a memory. But as the pages went on, the words changed. The tone grew desperate. There were notes about financial struggles, angry letters from investors, and arguments with city officials. The man mentioned losing workers, equipment being seized, and delays that kept piling up. It was clear he had been fighting a battle alone. One line caught Daniel's eye. "If they take away the dream, they take away me too." He closed the journal slowly. Whoever this man was, he hadn't just built a structure. He had built his soul into that ship. The next morning, Daniel met Peter, Leo, and Howard at a small diner near the highway. They all looked tired, like people who had seen something they couldn't forget. The table between them was quiet for a long moment before Peter spoke. "I went to the county office this morning," he said. "I found something." He laid out a folder filled with old papers and black and white photos. One picture showed the same ship they had explored, except brand new without vines or rust. Workers stood proudly in front of it. In the middle of the photo was a tall man in a white suit, his hand resting on a railing, smiling like someone who believed nothing could go wrong. "That's him," Peter said. "That's RM." His full name was Richard Myers. According to the records, Richard had been a shipping magnate in the 1960s. He owned a small fleet of cargo vessels and made a fortune transporting goods across the Atlantic. But after an accident at sea destroyed one of his ships and nearly cost him his life, he walked away from the ocean completely. That was when he came up with his strange new idea to bring the cruise experience to land. He bought hundreds of acres of forest and hired the best engineers and architects he could find. His vision was to build a stationary ship that offered everything a real one did: fine dining, cabins, entertainment halls, except the motion of waves. People would drive in, stay for a week, and feel like they had traveled the world without ever leaving the ground. The papers showed blueprints, promotional sketches, and even early advertisements. One slogan read, "The ocean without the storm." It had been a bold dream, far ahead of its time, but it didn't last. Construction costs skyrocketed, permits were denied, and investors pulled out. The project shut down halfway through completion. Local papers reported that Richard had gone bankrupt and disappeared shortly afterward. No one knew where he went. Howard leaned back, sighing deeply. So he built it with his own money until he couldn't anymore. And when everyone left, he stayed behind. Daniel nodded. That's what the journal said too. Peter flipped through another document. It also says the property was never officially sold. No one ever reclaimed it. It just got forgotten, left to rot. Leo looked down, his voice quiet. He gave everything for a dream that nobody understood. That night they decided to return once more. This time not as explorers, but as witnesses, to uncover the full story of the man who refused to let go of his creation. When they reached the forest, the air felt strangely calm, almost expectant. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the trees. The ship stood like a sleeping giant, silent and proud, as if waiting for them to return. They entered through the same door and followed the narrow corridors back toward the captain's quarters. The smell of old paper and metal filled the air. Inside the office, Daniel placed the journal on the desk where they had found it, aligning it with the ring-shaped marks left by a long-gone coffee mug. This was his spot, he said softly. Howard ran his hand across the surface of the desk. You can almost feel how much time he spent here. Peter looked at the wall where the blueprints hung. They were covered in dust, but the lines were still clear. Each hallway, cabin, and ballroom drawn with precision. Notes were scribbled in the margins in the same handwriting as the journal. Make the guests feel the sea breeze. Install motion floor panels. Music every night at 8. Leo lifted his camera and began filming again, this time slower, more respectfully. If we're going to tell this story, he said quietly, we have to tell it right. Not as some spooky legend, but as a story about a man who dreamed too big. They spent hours searching the room for more clues. Behind a large map frame, Daniel found a small metal box bolted to the wall. It was locked, but Howard managed to pry it open carefully with a screwdriver. Inside were old photographs, black and white, some faded, some water-stained. They showed the ship at different stages of construction. Workers welding beams, painters adding final touches, and Richard himself standing proudly beside his creation. But there was one photograph that stood out. It showed Richard sitting alone in the ballroom, surrounded by empty tables. The lights were still on, the room unfinished, but there was a calm smile on his face. On the back of the photo were the words, "She's alive now." Peter whispered. He really believed this place was alive. They found more notes tucked away in drawers and behind books. Some were just sketches of guests, others lists of ideas, new attractions, shows, menus. But toward the end, the notes became stranger. One read, "If they won't come, I'll stay for them." Another said, "She's too beautiful to be left alone." It was heartbreaking. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Richard had slowly withdrawn from the world. He had poured everything, money, time, hope, into something no one else believed in. And when that dream collapsed, he couldn't walk away. Howard closed the box gently. He wasn't crazy, he said. He was just in love with what he built. Some people create because they want others to see it. Some create because they need it to exist even if no one else understands. They left the office and made their way down to the ballroom one last time. The chandeliers swayed slightly and moonlight poured through the cracked ceiling. Dust sparkled in the air like tiny stars. Daniel looked around the room, imagining how it must have looked in its prime. Music playing, guests laughing, glasses clinking. He could almost hear it. Peter walked over to the old intercom panel. "Let's see if it still works." Howard nodded cautiously. "Just don't touch the wiring too much." Peter pressed one of the buttons gently. There was a soft crackle followed by silence. Then faintly, the same recorded voice they'd heard before came through again. "Welcome aboard the Nova Horizon. Please enjoy your stay." But this time it didn't stop. A second voice followed, weaker and slower, like a man speaking into an old microphone. "If anyone finds this," the voice said, trembling slightly, "please remember this ship was built with love. She never needed the sea. She just needed people to believe." The message ended abruptly. No one spoke. The air in the room felt still, almost sacred. They all knew whose voice it was, Richard's. His final words left behind like a farewell. Leo lowered his camera. "He really did stay until the end," he said softly. "He finished it in his own way." Daniel looked up at the ceiling. Maybe he's still here, not as a ghost but as part of what he made. The group stood in silence for a while, listening to the faint echo of the wind moving through the empty halls. There was no fear, no unease, only a deep sense of respect. Before leaving, Daniel placed the journal and photos back inside the drawer where they'd found them. "Let them stay here," he said. "This is where they belong." When they stepped outside, the night air felt lighter. The forest rustled softly as if it too was breathing again. Behind them, the massive ship stood still, glowing faintly under the moonlight, not haunted, not broken, but peaceful. Peter turned back for one last look. "He built something people laughed at," he said quietly. "But in the end, it became a legend." Howard nodded. Sometimes dreams don't die. They just wait for someone to notice them again. And as they walked back through the forest, none of them spoke another word. Each carried the same quiet thought, that some dreams are too big to vanish, and sometimes even a forgotten ship in the woods can tell a story about faith, love, and the power of not giving up.